morning. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dirk van der Mest. Welcome in you being with us for our series, Your Faith Matters. What we do is we take our message on Sunday for the series and we talk about it further during the week in our small groups. And for us, in the two groups that I'm involved in, it's had a big impact in terms of how we view faith and how we've grown in applying our faith. Because faith isn't what I know about faith. Faith is how I apply faith and what that means in my life. And some of you might not be familiar with this concept, even though might not be familiar with how we apply the concept, but you will be familiar with foyer, living room, and kitchen. And it's when somebody comes to visit you, you meet them in the foyer. And you figure out where that conversation goes. And if both of you are comfortable, you invite them into the living room. Then the conversation goes a bit deeper than who are you and what do you do, but we start to share a bit more in the living room. And then, depending on where that relationship goes to, it ends up in the kitchen. I knew you were thinking something else, but no. That relationship ends up in the kitchen. And that's where it really makes sense. You really connect and you have the difficult conversations that come up every now and then. You're not going to have those difficult conversations in the foyer with somebody. And for us, it's the same in terms of what we do. Because when we meet each other on a Sunday, it's the foyer. We know each other's names, we know a bit about each other, but when we go to something like the ladies' garden party yesterday, now obviously I wasn't there, but for the ladies that were there, that's where you go a bit deeper rather than just your name and what it is that you do. That's your living room. But group for us, and specifically life group, that's where you really get to build relationships, people that you can depend on and rely on. And that's where we have the difficult conversations. That's why discussions around our topics on a Sunday every now and then is so useful. Because you can really be open with the group and say, I know I'm supposed to do this, but I struggle with it. Can you guys pray with me? And you've got somebody that you trust and you say, can I have you as my accountability partner? Can I check in with you in the week when I struggle with this? That's the kind of relationships that we build. And that's why I'm encouraging you, like Tiana shared earlier, about groups that are open. If you're not in a group, get involved. Now is the right time as we're taking these topics a bit further and unpacking that. So if you've joined us for a special occasion this morning, I'm going to catch you up in terms of where we are with the series so you don't feel left out. So week 1, we said, what is faith and why it matters. So it set the scene for what it is that we're talking about in our series. We said that we all believe, we just don't believe in what really matters. So even somebody that we connected to faith and that person doesn't in faith in terms of religion and going to church, and somebody might say, that's not me. So they might come and say, well, I don't have faith. We've come to acknowledge that we all believe in a lot of things and put our trust and faith in a lot of things. There are better options out there than what we're currently putting our faith in. Then for week 2, we said faith when life falls apart. Because often we think when I step into this relationship with God, then suddenly my life is maanskyn en rose. Sunshine and flowers and birds. But life isn't like that. We know that. So we unpack that whole concept of what role does my faith play when life just happens and life is just life? Where's my faith? What does my faith look like and what role does it play? So for us this week, we're saying faith isn't religion. Now this seems like two contradicting terms because we connect faith with religion. We say when we talk about faith, it's usually within the space of church. I know some of you, the way that you support the Blue Bulls, it's as if you put your faith in the Blue Bulls, right? You might not acknowledge it, but we see it on the outside. Now, I'm just being facetious because I don't watch sport. But when life gets difficult, you're not going to put your trust in the Blue Bulls to help you there, right? You might believe that they're going to win this game, but when life gets tough, your faith isn't put in the Blue Bulls. Right. So What we're saying is faith isn't religion. This is what we're going to unpack for this morning. And for the sake of this morning, because we're going to look at Hebrews 8, I'm going to just expand a bit on what Jacques said in week 1. He said, we believe that Paul might have written very complicated tenses that I had to translate there in a second. We probably believe that Paul wrote Hebrews, but we don't know for sure. So what that means is for a lot of the books in the New Testament, we know who wrote them. For Hebrews, we're not 100% sure. We can't, with 100% clarity, prove that Paul wrote them. If you go back to our previous series, The Fundamentalist, where we said what is key and core to our faith and what is on the periphery, we looked at our faith isn't built on the Bible being true, even though we believe that the Bible is true. Our faith isn't based on a manuscript. Our faith is based on the fact that Jesus said something about himself, that he was the Son of God, and that his death and resurrection proved what he said. That is what our faith is built on, right? So if we can be comfortable with that, then we can be comfortable with the fact that we don't know if Paul wrote Hebrews, and we might not be able to prove 100% who wrote Hebrews. So if what I said now is challenging you on how you view the Bible and how you view faith, go back to The Fundamentalist. Watch it from week 1. It's an 8-week series. It will be worth your while, and you will be comfortable with the fact that we can't prove that Paul wrote Hebrews. But for the sake of the argument, looking at how it's structured, we can say probably 80% probability, right? Which makes it a better probability than the weather forecast, that Paul wrote it. And for the sake of this morning, instead of the person that wrote Hebrews, I will just say Paul says. And then we're all on the same page, and I'm not tricking anybody into believing something that they shouldn't or wouldn't believe. We're all comfortable with that. Fantastic. So let's have a look at specifically Hebrews 8 and what is written there in terms of our statement that faith isn't religion. Verse 1. Now the main point of what we are saying is this. We do have such a high priest. When we start the section with, now the main point of, it means a lot has happened up until now. Now the point that I'm moving forward on is this. In other words, we can't just start here and I expect you to follow with me. I would encourage you during the rest of the week, go and read chapters 1 to 7. So I know it's kind of a bum deal. You thought you were here for one event. Now I'm giving you homework and you have to read Hebrews 1 to 7. But it will be worth your while, and the message of this morning will just resonate so much more with you. So go and read chapters 1 to 7 because it moves up to this point to build this argument that Paul is setting out for us. So he's saying we do have such a high priest. Let's continue. Who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. So where is this high priest? In heaven, on the right hand side of the throne. And who serves in the sanctuary, the holy place, which is the temple, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, right? That sanctuary is the tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. It's a lot, and it's a lot to process. So what we need to understand, the reason why this letter is called Hebrews is because I nearly made an inappropriate joke, so let me not do that. It's called Hebrews. Well, you can see where I was going, right? Fill in the blanks. It's called Hebrews because Paul wrote it for the Hebrews, the Jews. So when Paul uses this imagery, they know exactly what this looks like. For us, we have to think of pictures, if we were lucky, from when we had a children's Bible, on what the temple looked like, and if we had an illustrated Bible, on what the temple looked like. That's what we have to draw on. But that's literally where they were on Friday, when this is read to them as a congregation. This is where they were on Friday, at the temple. So for us, it's the same as when I use the word church, even though We are the church, and we are Jesus' body. When I say the word church, you think of this moment. Because we sit in the church. This is what we think of. So when Paul uses this imagery, they understood it because it's what they live. Right? And he says, we have a high priest. He's in the throne in heaven right now. He serves in the real temple, which is the model for what you have just been to. It was set up by God and not by human beings. Right? Then he focuses on the high priest, verse 3. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Again, when I speak to you about high priest, luckily Paul gives us information. But we don't know really what that means. But they knew. And they knew the high priest needs to bring gifts and sacrifices. And what the high priest did was, let's say I had a business deal. The deal is successful, and I know I was number 3 on the list, but why did I get that contract? It must be God that have opened up a door for this. What would I do? I would go to my wife, and I would say to her, man, this is amazing. There's no way on paper we would have got this contract. God opened up this door for us. And together we would pray and give thanks to God for that. This is what we would do today. But in the Old Testament time, we would decide what we would take to the temple to offer as an offer of thanksgiving. Right? So that's what the high priest had to do, is bring gifts. But then also, what's the other important thing that the high priest did? Was bring the sacrifice for sin. Because God made it clear, if you transgress my laws, the result of that is, at the end of the day, needs to be paid for in blood. And that's the sacrifice that the high priest had to bring at the temple. So, it's connecting me with God, and it's allowing me to have a kind of relationship with God, because my sin is now paid for. That's the two functions of the high priest, mediation and reconciliation. Paul then says, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. Now, if we read 1 to 7, then we would know, even though it's not clearly stated here, that this high priest is Jesus. It's like 9 out of 10 answers in church is Jesus, right? So you could have gone there straight away. And if you read 1 to 7, you will see it's Jesus. So Jesus is our high priest. And Paul's saying, Jesus also has gifts and sacrifices, have something to offer. So let's go to verse 5. They serve at a sanctuary. So the high priests that you are familiar with, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. So what we have here is a copy of what is in heaven. Now, kids these days, it was much more the demographic of the first service towards younger generation. For they don't understand what a copy is. There's a photo that's taken with a camera. If they want a copy of that, they go and they print that copy. If the dog eats it, they go to that same photo, they print it. It's the same photo that pops out. We weren't that lucky. We had photocopiers. So you have the original, you photocopy. If that photocopy gets missing, you photocopy the photocopy, and now you've got a copy of a copy, and by the 10th one that you've made, you can hardly recognize the ID photo in there. So that's what Paul is saying, is understand that this is an interpretation of what God has intended, right? This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. And that's in Exodus when he received the 10 commandments. Verse 6. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one. So now there's a gear shift. Now suddenly what we read here is not only is the temple a representation of what is supposed to be in heaven, but the high priest Jesus does what our earthly high priest does. But even in what he does, what Jesus does is so much better. And that's where we're going to really spend a bit of time on. Since the new covenant is established on better promises. So there's a covenant that was in place. There's a new covenant that came with a new promise that's better than the old one. So in what we read here is, and for us we're lucky because we can literally have it, we can read, we can page back if something doesn't make sense. For them, that letter was read to them in front of the congregation. All of it they had to take in by hearing, not by seeing. There's no projector, there's no on the screen. It's just simply a guy in front reading. And they did what we all do when we sit in here. Like in the middle, we just take a quick intermission break, and then we're back. So we might have missed something. That's why Paul repeats it. So in case this is read to you, and you missed it, I'm repeating it. That also tells us that this is really important. So we can look at what Paul is writing, and we can then say, but he's repeating that 3 times. That means this is important. And what Paul is repeating for us continuously in this section is the high priest is better. The temple is better. What he does is better. In other words, what God had in mind and what he sets up with the second covenant is way better than the first one. Verse 7. For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. If nothing was wrong with the first contract, we wouldn't need a second contract. So we ask the question, but God, did you then set up a contract that wasn't done properly? But God found fault with the people and said, in other words, it was a contract between 2 parties, God and Israel. The problem wasn't the contract. The problem was the people. Verse 8. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. God's saying there's a time coming where I'm making a new covenant, and that covenant has come through Jesus. And the good news for us is that we are included in that covenant. Because the original covenant was with Israel and with Judah. The second covenant is with all the people, including us, the Gentiles. We are included in that covenant. It's not as that covenant is there and we kind of take the back door and we slip into the covenant. This covenant was set up to include us. So, just from that perspective, we understand that it's a better covenant. It's a better contract. Verse 9. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. So there's an order to what has happened. The covenant was set up. The Israelites turned away from God, and God turned away from them. It's not a decision that God took, I'm done with you. It's a decision that the people made, like, we know better. We want something different. And they drifted from God. So verse 10. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. So already there we see a big difference. Because what happened in the first covenant? It was written on clay tablets. They took those tablets and put them in the ark. And that ark went into the Holy of Holies, into the temple. Literally, God's law was written on tablets and it was there somewhere specific. And it's easy to understand within that context that I lived my life, and when I think of God, I think of His prescriptions, and it's somewhere far away, disconnected from me. But this starts to change, because God says, I will put my laws in their minds. What happens when you binge watch a series, you only think of that series and how people react, and it reminds you of a scene. This is what plays out there, is exactly this. Is what you fill your life with, is how you start to view life. So if your mind is filled with God's law, you view life through that. Again, what we discovered through the fundamentalists, and that's why it's key for you to watch that to fully understand this message, is that the law that God speaks about is not about, when we talk about sin, about breaking a law for Jesus. It's about what harms me and what harms people around me. And if it harms me or it harms people, it's a sin. That's why God hates sin, not because we're breaking a law, but because we're either hurting ourselves or we're hurting somebody else. And that's not what He wants for us. He wants the best for us. That's why He writes these laws in our mind. Because it's not about the law and when you break the law, but it's about guardrails that are up to keep myself safe and keep the people around me safe. So I can't start to negotiate with God, because then I say, I know better, and I'm going to start moving outside of guardrails where it's unsafe. And then when something bad happens, then our first thing is to blame God. But we decided to start moving outside of guardrails. But also what He says is, I will write them on their hearts. And not so much the law, but the principle of the law will be written in our hearts. That's the place that you will live from. That my focus is what I've got in mind for people. If that's the best version of them that they can be, that's what I want for them. And what I want you to want for the people around you. It changes everything, rather than just, am I sticking to a law? Am I ticking boxes? Am I pleasing God? Verse 12. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. So if you ever wonder if God is about breaking rules and ticking off on a score chart how we're doing, then this verse tells you that it's got nothing to do with that. Because He says, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Who of us struggle with sin and struggle with forgiving ourselves? And part of that struggle is, if I can't forgive myself, how can God forgive me? If you ever wondered, go and write Hebrews 8 verse 12 on a piece of paper and stick it on your fridge. Because God says, I will remember it no more. So why should you remember it? And live with that burden as if I'm burdening you with that. So if we wondered if it's about laws, it's not about laws. It's not about breaking those laws. And what do we often do? We often live within this space of, my purpose is to please God. And if I do things wrong, I stop pleasing God. And I have to do the right thing to please God so that I don't fall out of favor with Him. If that's the way that we think, that's why it's so easy for us when life gets tough and the wheels fall off, that our first place that we go to is, where did I disappoint God? Because He must be punishing me for something. Instead of saying, this happens to everybody. It just so happens that this happens to me. And while this is happening to me, the difference is I go through this differently. Because God is going through this with me. And here's the amazing part. That's why Paul says this new covenant is way better than the old one. Because what did they have in the old covenant when they're going through life's difficulties? A God that never came to earth. And if God never came to earth, how would God know when I lose a loved one? How would He know what that feels like? If I've poured my life into my child and I see them ruining their life, how would he know how that feels? I believe he cares, I believe he's there, but does he know how I feel? Our good news is he knows exactly how we feel. Because the Father said, I love these people so much. They're so far away from me that I'm going to sacrifice my son for them. I've got no guarantee that they will turn to me, but I'm going to sacrifice my son for them. We've got baby dedications after this. As a parent, imagine saying, I'm going to give the life of my child for somebody that I don't know if they're going to reciprocate this. And Jesus saying, I'm willing to give my life for them, not knowing that they will respond in the same way. And it's not a chess game where God made the first move and we make the next move and he makes the next move. If anything existed like it, in one move it was checkmate. God made the one and the final move. It's up to us to respond to it. There's no steps of stepping into relationship with God. Everything was given to us from the start. With those two things, that's why this covenant is way better than the first one. Because in one action, Jesus paying that sacrifice, and the difference between his sacrifice and what your earthly high priests sacrificed is they had every year to bring that sacrifice for your sins. Jesus came and in one action paid what's full mark, the perfect, but it goes beyond it. There's another word that's better. Complete, perfect, without fault, the one sacrifice, the only sacrifice that is needed to pay for our sins. That's the first thing that Jesus did. The second thing that he did was step into our mess. So that when we cry out to him, he's gone through that. And he knows what it feels like. What we will physically experience, for most of us, will never come close to what Jesus experienced in the journey up to the cross. When it comes to physical pain. In terms of emotional pain, again, we can go through difficult things, but we will not come close to experiencing what Jesus experienced. Always being connected to the Father. And in praying in John for us, he said, Father, I pray for the fellow believers that they will be one as we are one. Because they've always been one. And in that moment that he died on the cross and he took our sins on him, he knew his Father would turn away from him. For the first time in his life, he was alone. And it's not the physical pain that he was afraid of at the night in Gethsemane. It was the not being connected to my Father for something I didn't do, but because he loves us that much. To be without his Father so that we would never have to be without our Father. That's the new covenant that God has called us into. So when we step into faith and we think faith is about pleasing God, we've missed the whole point of what God intended. Because then we live our life with a burden on our shoulders. It's that I make decisions, I want to do things, I want to achieve things, but I can't not please God. But through the new covenant, what God is saying to us, I am pleased with you. I love you. You are my son and you are my daughter. There's nothing you can do that will remove you from being my son, from being my daughter. You will always be my son. You will always be my daughter. I am well pleased with you. So when we do things for God, it's because we are thankful for what He's done for us. Not because we feel there's an expectation that we need to do something. We need to respond in kind. And I want to close with this example. For 8 out of 10 conversations that I have, 2 out of 10 conversations, when I ask them about their relationship with God, for 2 out of 10 they will say, I have no relationship with God because they don't believe. For 8 out of 10 that do believe, when I ask them, tell me about your relationship with God, they will say things like, I go to church on a Sunday. I read my Bible, I pray, I do good things for people, and I give money to people who need it and to the church. We all think it's good answers. Let me give you a different context, and I've used the example before. My boys are 22 and they're twins. It's as if you had a conversation with them and you asking my boys, tell me about your relationship with your father. And they say to you, I wash his car once a month. I mow the lawn every week when it's summer. And I help him with stuff around the house when he needs to. If I had to hear that conversation, I would be disappointed in myself. Because everything that they're sharing is about what they're doing for me. And nothing about a relationship. So why would our Heavenly Father, that gave everything for us, be pleased with? I go to church on a Sunday, I pray, I read my Bible. And nothing about everything in me cries out to you. And I'm welcome in your presence anytime. And you are interested in my life. And you know what I'm going through in my life. The joys and the heartaches. Because it's that kind of intimate relationship that we have. Can you see that it changes the conversation in completely a different way? Can you start to get excited with what Paul is saying, why this new covenant is way better than the old covenant? But what we do is we take parts of the old covenant and we bring it into the new covenant and we spoil it. So my encouragement for you this morning is to really wrestle with what is this thing that God has called you to? What is this faith that is stirred in you, and what are you doing with that faith? And how is it changing how you relate to Him and how you relate to the people around you? Because that's what it needs to do. Faith is something that is lived. It's not something that is read and some knowledge that is transferred. We're going to have 2 couples with their families dedicating their children. And it just makes perfect sense that we're doing it within the series, because what those parents are saying is, I am living my faith, which is a relational faith. Not a religion where we're ticking boxes. And because I live my faith, I set this example for my child to follow. As parents, we like to say, do as I say and not as I do. But these parents are saying, go and do what I do, because that's the best thing you can do with your life. And what they're doing is saying this in front of us and saying, this is what I want for you. So we get to share that with them, which is a wonderful opportunity. I'm going to close in prayer for us. Jock is going to come up on stage, and then he's going to invite the parents up. So let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for this message of faith, a faith that is lived and a faith that calls us into relationship. Thank you that you've paved the way completely for us to step into this intimate relationship that we have for you and with you. And thank you that we can live in such a way that we can invite people to experience that as well for themselves. So I thank you for that. Amen.